The Texas sun burned the back of my neck. The gravel beneath my boots radiated heat, each stone holding onto the morning like it refused to let go. Somewhere nearby, a truck engine idled, slow and patient. Wood scraped against wood. A crate lid shifted. I did not yet know what the smell was. That was the most frightening part. This stories aren't about how America won the war, but about how America treated its enemies who fought on the battlefield. If you're truly proud of that, please subscribe to the channel and keep following us. For 8 months, fruit had not existed in my world. Not as food, not as taste, not even as memory I trusted. Fruit was something from before ration cards shrank, before supply trains stopped coming, before we learned to measure life in ladles of gray soup and slices of bread so thin they felt more like apologies than meals. Fruit belonged to childhood kitchens and markets that no longer existed, to colors I was no longer sure were real. So when the scent reached me, my mind rejected it outright. It searched for explanations that fit the rules I had learned to survive by. Maybe it was cleaning supplies. Maybe it was animal feed. Maybe it was something chemical, something meant to confuse us. I watched the women beside me shift their weight, their faces tight and unreadable, each of us pretending not to notice the same impossible thing. The Americans did not shout. They did not hurry. I stood there holding the apple longer than made sense. The sun climbed higher, the gravel burned hotter, and still no one moved. It was as if time itself had slowed, waiting to see who would make the first mistake. I could feel the weight of the apple in my palm, solid and undeniable, yet my body refused to accept it as real. Around me, other women stared at their hands as if they were holding something dangerous. That was when the fear arrived. Not the sharp kind, not panic, the old kind, the trained kind. The kind that had been planted years earlier and watered carefully until it grew roots too deep to pull out. Before we surrendered, before the lines collapsed and the maps stopped making sense, an officer had gathered us in a concrete room with no windows. His uniform was still clean then, pressed, the insignia sharp against the fabric. He spoke calmly, deliberately, as if explaining a technical detail rather than preparing us for captivity. "The Americans," he said, "will not beat you with sticks. They are more clever than that." He paused, letting the silence do its work. "They will feed you. They will offer comforts. And they will watch how you react." Food, he told us, was their weapon. They would use it to humiliate us, to soften us, to make us forget who we were. Anyone who accepted it too quickly would be marked. Anyone who showed gratitude would be remembered. Anyone who hesitated would be broken slowly. "Do not eat first," he warned. "Do not show relief. And never forget that nothing they give is free." Those words returned now with terrifying clarity. Holding the apple, I imagined invisible eyes tracking every movement. I imagined lists, notes, names quietly recorded somewhere beyond the fence. My fingers tightened reflexively and I forced myself to loosen them again, afraid that even that small reaction might betray me. Was it poisoned? Was it a test? Was this the moment we were meant to fail? The fear was not abstract. It was precise, rehearsed, practical. We had been trained to expect cruelty disguised as kindness, to expect that humiliation would come wrapped in generosity. I looked down the line. No one had bitten yet. That felt like safety. I watched an older woman a few places ahead of me lift the apple toward her face, hesitate, then lower it again as if she had burned her hand. Her jaw clenched, her expression flat, disciplined. I recognized it immediately. The look of someone obeying an order long after the officer who gave it was gone. We had learned fear well. By 1944, Germany no longer pretended otherwise. At home, fruit had disappeared first. Apples became rumors. Oranges became stories. Even potatoes were rationed so tightly they felt borrowed rather than owned. Civilian meals had been reduced to what could be stretched, scraped, or salvaged. Turnips replaced everything. Potatoes were boiled until they surrendered their last usefulness. Bread arrived gray and damp, cut carefully to hide the mold blooming just beneath the crust. People learned to eat around rot. People learned not to ask. Letters from home had grown shorter, then quieter. When fruit appeared in a memory, it was almost always followed by correction. That was before. That doesn't exist anymore. Hunger taught us to revise our past as much as our expectations. And yet, standing there in Texas, the apples in the crate did not look rare. They did not look precious. They looked normal. That, too, was frightening, because nothing about America had prepared us for this kind of contradiction. We had been told the Americans were wasteful, decadent, undisciplined, that they relied on machines because they lacked will, that their abundance made them weak. And yet nothing about this moment felt careless. The apples were clean, sorted, intact, not thrown, not flaunted. They had not brought them out to impress us. They had brought them out because apparently this was lunchtime. That realization unsettled me more than any threat could have. I thought of what I had seen through train windows on the journey west. Fields that did not end. Gardens behind small houses, neat and purposeful, growing food in straight lines as if order itself had been planted into the soil. I remembered passing towns where women bent over backyard plots. Victory gardens, someone had called them, producing vegetables not just for themselves, but for the war effort. I had not understood it then. I was beginning to understand it now. These apples were not special. They were ordinary. That was the problem. If the Americans ate like this every day, if this abundance was routine rather than symbolic, then everything we had been taught about strength and sacrifice needed to be reconsidered. It meant that generosity here was not weakness. It was surplus. It meant they could afford mercy. I looked at the apple again. A faint blemish near the stem. Nothing perfect ever is, I thought. The thought surprised me. It sounded almost reasonable. Still, fear held me, because fear had been useful once. Fear had kept us alive when bombs fell and supplies vanished. Fear had taught us discipline. Fear had told us when to stay silent. But now, fear was doing something else. It was standing between me and a simple act that should not have mattered at all. Eating an apple. The Americans waited, not impatiently, not sternly. They leaned against the truck, talked among themselves, glanced over occasionally without intensity. One man wiped sweat from his forehead and took a sip from his canteen. Another laughed at something I could not hear. No one pointed. No one counted. No one ordered. That absence of pressure began to feel heavier than any command. If this were a test, it was a strange one. There was no obvious correct answer, no signal, no consequence made visible, and that ambiguity gnawed at me. We had been trained for certainty, even brutal certainty. This quiet openness was unfamiliar territory. I realized suddenly that if I bit into the apple, it would not just be eating. It would be choosing to believe something new, and belief was dangerous. Belief had led us here. My heart beat louder in my ears. I remembered my mother's hands peeling potatoes at the kitchen table, saving the skins because they still held something useful. I remembered how she had stopped asking for fruit long before it disappeared. Asking made hunger sharper. Accepting made it dull. Across the yard, a breeze lifted dust into the air. It settled on my sleeve, on the apple's skin. I brushed it away, instinctively, then froze, embarrassed by the gesture. Caring for it felt like a kind of surrender. I thought of the officer's voice again. They will feed you to humiliate you. But humiliation usually came with laughter, or cruelty, or spectacle. There was none of that here, only waiting. And the longer they waited, the more something inside me shifted. Not hope, not yet, but doubt. Doubt in the certainty we had been given. I wondered, for the first time, if fear itself had been the weapon all along. Not American fear, but ours. The apple rested in my hand, unchanged, and slowly, uncomfortably, I began to suspect that whatever the Americans were doing here, it was not about breaking us. It was about letting us break ourselves free from something far older and far more fragile than hunger. The thought frightened me more than any poison ever could. A few of them stood near the truck in wide-brimmed hats, their sleeves rolled up, their posture loose in a way that still unsettled me. One leaned against the side of the vehicle, chewing slowly, as if this moment required no particular effort. Another lifted the lid of a wooden crate and let it rest there, open, exposed. That was when I saw the color. Red, yellow, green, whole, unbroken, apples, not slices, not bruised scraps cut small to make them easier to divide and harder to steal, not boiled down into something unrecognizable. These were apples the way they were meant to be, round, firm, their skins catching the sunlight as if they had never known hunger. My first thought was not hunger, it was disbelief. My second thought was fear, because the apples were too perfect. Nothing in our lives had been perfect for a long time. Perfection suggested intention. It suggested planning. It suggested a trick. For 8 months, my body had learned to accept less without complaint. It had learned that wanting too much was dangerous. But my mind froze completely in that moment. It could not reconcile what my eyes were seeing with what I knew to be true. One apple rolled slightly as the truck shifted, bumping gently against another. The sound was small, solid, real. No one moved. I realized then that I had been holding my breath. A woman, 2 places down from me, whispered something under her breath in German, a wordless sound that might have been a prayer or a warning. Another clenched her hand so tightly her knuckles went pale. I felt a strange pressure behind my eyes, not tears yet, but something close. I was not shocked because I was starving. I was shocked because my mind refused to believe that the world still contained things like this. An American voice spoke, calm, unremarkable, almost bored. I did not understand the words at first. Then a translator repeated them, his tone careful, neutral. They are for you. No explanation, no conditions. Just that. I stared at the apples as if they might change shape if I looked too long. My thoughts scattered, colliding with memories I had not touched in years. A kitchen table, a bowl of fruit. My mother cutting slices without counting them. The memory felt dangerous, like stepping onto ice that might not hold. I remember thinking that this could not be about kindness. Kindness did not survive war. Kindness was what propaganda promised would disappear first. And yet, here it was, sitting in a wooden crate on a Texas morning, unguarded, unperformed, unashamed. In that moment, standing there with sweat on my spine and dust in my mouth, I understood something without fully grasping it yet. This was not a story about victory. These stories are not about how America won the war, but about how America treated its enemies who fought on the battlefield. And if you find yourself proud of that, if you believe that kind of strength is worth remembering, then stay with us. Subscribe, and keep following these stories. Because what happened next would change how I understood power forever. The apples were passed out one by one. No numbers were taken. No one rushed us. The Americans watched, but not in the way guards usually watch prisoners. Their eyes were not sharp. They were not waiting for a mistake. It was as if they were observing weather, something ordinary, something expected. When the apple was placed into my hands, I almost dropped it. It was heavier than I expected, cool against my palms despite the heat. I turned it slowly, inspecting it for flaws, for hidden rot, for something that would make this make sense. There was nothing, just smooth skin and a faint, honest smell that now had a name I had not allowed myself to think until that second. Fruit. My body reacted before my thoughts did. Saliva filled my mouth. My stomach tightened painfully, not with hunger exactly, but with recognition. My hands trembled, and I hated them for it. I hated that something so small could undo me. I did not bite it. Not yet. Around me, no one did. We stood there, a line of women holding apples like fragile artifacts, afraid that the moment we acknowledged their reality, it would vanish. The sun climbed higher. Somewhere in the distance, a bird called. An American laughed at something unrelated, the sound carrying easily across the yard. I realized then that the most unsettling thing about this moment was not the apples themselves. It was how normal the Americans made it feel. As if giving fruit to enemy prisoners was not an act of mercy or strategy or spectacle, but simply the way things were done. And that realization frightened me more than hunger ever had. No one told us what to do next. That was the first thing that felt wrong. After years of living by commands, spoken, implied, or feared, I kept waiting for an order that did not come. The apples sat in our hands. The Americans stood nearby. Time passed, and still nothing happened. It felt like the moment just before punishment, when silence stretches so thin it becomes a sound of its own. But the punishment never arrived. One of the cowboys shifted his weight, reached into the crate, took an apple for himself, and bit into it. Hard. The sound was loud in the quiet yard, a clean, unmistakable crunch. Juice ran down his wrist, catching the sunlight. He chewed without hurry, jaw working steadily, eyes half closed against the brightness. When he finished the bite, he wiped his hand on his jeans and reached for another. That was it. No announcement, no explanation, no moral lesson. Just a man eating an apple. Something in my chest loosened, almost against my will. If this was a performance, it was the worst one imaginable. No emphasis. No audience awareness. No care for whether we were watching or not. He ate the apple the way people eat when they are not trying to make a point. Because they are hungry. Because it is there. Because it is normal. "They're yours," another American said, as if the moment needed clarification. That was the sum of it. Not "you should be grateful," not "this proves something," not "remember who gave this to you." Just possession. Just permission. I had expected kindness, if it came at all, to arrive dressed as instruction. I had expected speeches about decency or democracy or mercy. Instead, what unsettled me most was how little the Americans seemed to care whether we understood what they were doing. They did not need us to acknowledge it. That, I began to realize, was the point. A woman beside me finally lifted her apple again. Her hand shook visibly this time. She brought it closer to her mouth, hesitated, then lowered it once more, breathing out sharply through her nose. I felt the same hesitation rise in me, that final resistance before something irreversible. I was still watching the cowboy when another small, almost invisible moment slipped past the line. A woman dropped her apple. It hit the gravel and rolled, picking up dust. She froze, staring down at it as if she had committed a crime. For a heartbeat, I expected shouting, a reprimand, something sharp and corrective. Instead, a young American soldier stepped forward, bent down, picked up the apple, brushed it against his pant leg, and held out a folded handkerchief. "Dusty," he said. Just that. No accusation. No warning. No visible concern that rules had been broken. The woman took the handkerchief without looking up, her fingers brushing his briefly. She wiped the apple carefully, as if it were fragile, then clutched it to her chest. The soldier stepped back and returned to where he had been standing, as if nothing worth remembering had occurred. That moment stayed with me, because it told me something no speech ever could. The Americans were not being kind to prove they were good. They were being kind because, to them, this was simply how strong people behaved. I thought about what I had seen since arriving in this country. The long trains loaded with supplies, the fields that seemed to stretch forever, the factories we passed at night, lit from within, still working while Europe slept in ruins. America in 1944 was producing everything, Planes, ships, food, uniforms, on a scale that made comparison pointless. And yet, standing here, there was no sense of triumph in their behavior, no pride being displayed, no need to remind us who was winning. That was what unsettled me most. Power, as I had known it, demanded recognition. It insisted on obedience. It reminded you constantly of its presence. But this power did not seem to require acknowledgement at all. It simply existed. The apple grew warm in my hand. I felt its weight again, but now it felt different. Less like evidence. More like permission. Permission to be human, perhaps. I raised it slowly, aware of my own breathing, of the heat on my face, of the quiet attention of the women around me who were all pretending not to watch each other. My teeth met the skin. For a split second I expected pain, or bitterness, or disappointment. Instead, there was sweetness, sharp and clean. Juice flooded my mouth, surprising me so completely that I had to close my eyes. It was too much. Not because it was rich, but because it was simple. The taste unlocked something I had kept sealed for years. A kitchen table, a bowl of apples left out because there were enough. Hands reaching without permission. No counting. No fear of being seen wanting. I swallowed hard and forced myself to keep chewing. Around me, others were biting too now. Some carefully. Some too fast. Some crying openly. Shoulders shaking as they tried to eat and breathe at the same time. The Americans did not look away, but neither did they stare. They let it happen. I realized then that what they were offering us was not just food. It was dignity without conditions. In Germany, strength had been measured by control, of people, of resources, of fear. Here, strength looked different. It looked like confidence so complete it did not need to announce itself. Like abundance that did not harden into cruelty. Like a nation that could feed its enemies the same food it fed its own people and feel no need to justify it. I thought suddenly of my father, of the stories he told about his own father, a man who worked with his hands, who believed that shouting was a sign of weakness and that work done quietly was the only kind that mattered. I had not thought of those stories in years. They had not fit the world I believed in anymore. But standing there in Texas, juice on my fingers, dust on my boots, they came back with unsettling clarity. My grandfather would have understood this moment. He would have understood men who did not need to prove they were strong. As I finished the apple, I noticed that none of the Americans were watching us anymore. They had turned back to their truck, to their conversation, to the business of the day. The moment had passed for them. For us, it had just begun. And for the first time since the war started, I felt something shift inside me that had nothing to do with hunger. It was the unsettling realization that mercy, when offered without performance, could be more powerful than any threat. And that frightened me, because it meant everything I had been taught about strength might be wrong. I thought the worst of it had already passed. I was wrong. The first bite was not the moment that broke us. It was what happened after. At first, the yard filled with small, ordinary sounds, chewing, swallowing, the soft scrape of boots on gravel. For a few seconds, it almost felt manageable, as if we could simply eat and move on, as if this were just another strange episode in a war that had already rewritten every rule. Then the bodies began to react. A woman to my left bit too hard, teeth meeting the apple with more force than control. I heard a sharp crack, followed by a sound halfway between a gasp and a sob. She pulled the apple away, pressing her hand to her mouth, eyes wide with shock. Blood dotted the corner of her lip where her gums had split. She stared at her fingers as if they belonged to someone else. Another woman coughed violently, juice going down the wrong way. She doubled over, apple clutched in one hand, the other braced against her knee. The coughing turned into retching. The retching into tears she could not stop. Her shoulders shook as if her body no longer recognized the difference between choking and crying. Someone laughed suddenly, a short, hysterical sound that startled all of us. It cut off just as abruptly, replaced by weeping so raw it made my chest ache. That was when I understood. It was not hunger doing this, it was memory. Our bodies had not forgotten how to starve. They had forgotten how to receive. I took another bite, smaller this time, trying to be careful, trying to be civilized. My teeth sent a sharp, unfamiliar pain through my jaw. I froze, apple still between my fingers, stunned by the sensation. The pain was not severe, but it was wrong. Wrong in a way that startled me. My mouth, like the rest of me, had adapted to deprivation. Soft foods, thin soups, bread soaked until it surrendered. Freshness was a shock. I chewed slowly, forcing myself to breathe through it, but my throat tightened anyway. Juice filled my mouth too quickly. I swallowed at the wrong moment and began to cough, sharp and uncontrollable. My eyes watered. The sound echoed embarrassingly loud in my own ears. For a split second, I felt anger. At myself, at the apple, at the weakness of this reaction. Then the anger dissolved into something far more frightening. Grief. Because as I stood there coughing and wiping my eyes, it became painfully clear that we did not remember how to eat an apple. Not properly. Not without fear. Not without calculation. We had forgotten the simple, unthinking trust that food would not hurt us. I lowered the apple and looked at it as if it had betrayed me. My hands were trembling now, the tremor spreading up my arms, settling deep in my chest. Around me, women were crying openly, no longer trying to hide it. Some turned away, ashamed. Others stared straight ahead, tears running down their faces without sound. The Americans did not intervene. They did not rush forward with instructions or concern. They let it happen. That, too, was unbearable, because there was nothing to fight against. I took another bite, determined now, almost stubborn. I chewed carefully, swallowing before taking the next. The sweetness was still there, but it no longer felt gentle. It felt overwhelming, like a voice raised too suddenly after years of silence. Halfway through the apple, something inside me shifted. Without thinking, I stopped. I looked down at what remained, smooth, pale flesh exposed, juice glistening in the sun, and a single automatic thought surfaced. Save it. My hands moved before I was aware of the decision. I slipped the remaining half of the apple into the pocket of my jacket, pressing it flat against my ribs. The fabric grew damp immediately. Cold juice seeped through the cloth, startling against my skin. I felt relief. Instant, undeniable relief, and with it came shame so sharp it made my stomach clench. I had not decided to save it. My body had. It was the same reflex that had taught me to hide crusts of bread, to swallow slowly so hunger would not return too quickly, to plan meals that did not exist yet. It was the reflex of someone who did not believe in tomorrow. I realized, standing there with apple juice soaking into my uniform, that my body was still living in a world where food vanished without warning. That was when the cowboy spoke. He was older than the others, his face lined, his voice calm and unhurried. He had been watching quietly, not with suspicion, but with something like recognition. "There will be more tomorrow," he said. Just that. No emphasis, no reassurance layered with explanation. There will be more tomorrow. The words hit me harder than the apple ever could. I felt my throat tighten instantly, my breath catching so suddenly it hurt. My hands clenched at my sides, fingers digging into the damp fabric over my ribs. For a moment, I thought I might collapse. Tomorrow. It was a word I had stopped trusting. Tomorrow was when rations were cut again. Tomorrow was when trains did not arrive. Tomorrow was when letters stopped coming. Tomorrow was always conditional, always shrinking, always something to fear rather than rely on. But the way he said it, casual, unquestioned, suggested that tomorrow was not a promise. It was an assumption. Something inside me broke open. I bent forward sharply, pressing my forehead into my palm, the sun suddenly too bright, the yard too large, Tears came without warning, hot and unstoppable, sliding down my face as my shoulders shook. I did not try to stop them. I could not. Around me, others were crying too now, some quietly, some openly, some with the helpless sounds of children who had fallen and did not yet know if comfort was coming. No one told us to stop. No one told us to compose ourselves. The Americans stood there, letting our collapse unfold, not out of indifference, but out of respect. They did not need to rescue us from it. They seemed to understand that this breaking was part of the repair. I wiped my face with the back of my hand and looked up again, my vision blurred. The cowboy had already turned away, walking back toward the truck as if he had said nothing remarkable at all. To him, it was simply a fact. There will be more tomorrow. I thought of my mother, standing at the stove years ago, stirring a pot that was never quite full enough. I remembered how she would say, "Eat slowly. There will be more," even when we both knew there might not be. She said it anyway, as if saying it could make it true. I wondered how many American children had grown up hearing the same words and believing them. I wondered what it did to a nation to grow up expecting tomorrow instead of fearing it. The apple pressed cold and damp against my side, a small, absurd weight that suddenly felt unbearable. I reached into my pocket and pulled it out again, embarrassed by the reflex, ashamed of the mistrust it revealed. My hands shook as I looked at it. I finished it. Slowly, deliberately. Not because I was hungry, but because I needed to teach my body something it had forgotten, that this moment did not need to be hoarded, that tomorrow was not a lie. When I swallowed the last bite, my chest ached in a way I could not explain. Around me, the yard was quiet again, the storm of emotion settling into something heavier, deeper. We stood among apple cores and damp handkerchiefs, red-eyed and exhausted. The Americans began to disperse, the truck engine starting again, the ordinary sounds of the camp resuming. For them, this was over. For us, it was not. Because something fundamental had collapsed inside us. Not our strength, not our discipline, but our certainty. And in its place, something dangerous had begun to grow. The idea that tomorrow might exist. The idea that some countries built their power on that belief. And that perhaps, once, this country had believed in it so completely that it could offer it even to its enemies. As the sun climbed higher over Camp Hearn, I stood there with sticky fingers and a trembling heart, knowing that whatever we were before this morning, we would not be that again. Hunger had taught us how to endure. But mercy, unperformed, unannounced, had taught us how to break. And somehow, in that breaking, the war felt closer to ending than it ever had before. That night I did not sleep. The camp settled into its usual rhythm, the guards changing shifts, the distant clank of metal, the low murmur of voices drifting between barracks. But inside me, nothing returned to order. I lay on my cot staring at the wooden beams above my head, the smell of apples still faint on my hands no matter how many times I rubbed them against the blanket. Something irreversible had happened. It was not exhaustion, it was not relief, it was understanding. I realized with a clarity that frightened me that we had not been defeated in that yard. We had been outgrown. The words came to me slowly, forming without effort as if they had been waiting for permission. They didn't defeat us with guns, they defeated us with apples. The thought felt almost blasphemous at first. For years, we had been taught that defeat only came through force, through broken lines, fallen cities, bodies counted and flags lowered. Strength was something you imposed. Victory was something you proved. But standing there earlier that day, watching women crumble under the weight of a simple kindness, I understood that another kind of power existed. One that did not shout. One that did not threaten. One that did not need to humiliate to be effective. I thought back to everything I had been taught about my own country. Discipline above all else. Fear as motivation. Control as virtue. We believed that order was strength and that mercy was weakness disguised as sentiment. We believed people worked best when watched, behaved best when frightened, and stayed loyal when deprived of alternatives. We built systems around those beliefs and called them necessary. And for a time, they worked. They produced obedience. They produced silence. They produced endurance. But they did not produce confidence. Here, in this place I had been warned to fear, I saw something different. The Americans did not control us through hunger. They did not motivate us through terror. They did not require us to perform gratitude or submission. They fed us. Not extravagantly. Not ceremonially. They fed us the same food they fed themselves. That distinction mattered more than I could articulate at first, because it meant they did not see us as something separate. They did not need us to be smaller in order to feel large. I thought of the numbers I had overheard guards discussing casually, as if they were weather reports. Planes rolling off assembly lines faster than anyone could count. Ships launched quicker than they could be sunk. Fields harvested at scales that defied European imagination. America in 1944 was producing more than the war demanded, and instead of hardening that abundance into cruelty, they had chosen to turn it into policy. I began to understand that this was not accidental. It was deliberate. The Americans had decided, somewhere far above this dusty Texas camp, that how they treated prisoners mattered, not because we deserved it, not because it was easy, but because it reflected who they believed themselves to be. They followed the Geneva Convention not reluctantly, but methodically. They documented meals, inspected barracks, provided medical care, allowed mail, not because anyone was watching closely enough to punish them if they failed, but because they believed rules meant something even when applied to enemies. Win the peace, not just the war. I had heard the phrase once, spoken by a guard as if it were obvious. At the time, I did not understand it. Now, lying awake with the echo of that apple crunch still in my ears, I did. This was not softness. This was confidence. A nation that believed it would still exist tomorrow did not need to extract suffering today. Back home, we had rationed fruit out of necessity. Here, they shared it out of principle. That difference mattered. One came from scarcity, the other from choice. I remembered the officer's warning again. How food would be used to humiliate us. How kindness would be a trap. How gratitude would be a weakness. He had been wrong, not because the Americans were kind, but because they were not trying to use kindness as a weapon at all. Weapons demand attention. Weapons require fear. Weapons seek reaction. What they offered us demanded nothing, and that was precisely why it worked. The apple had not asked me to renounce anything. It had not demanded loyalty or confession. It had simply existed, solid and real, placed in my hands without ceremony. My beliefs collapsed under that weight. I began to see the shape of a truth I had avoided for years, that our system required enemies to survive, required fear to function, required constant reminders of who was watching and who was being watched. This system did not. This system assumed strength, and assumption, I realized, is the ultimate privilege. The Americans assumed tomorrow would come. They assumed their factories would keep running, their fields would keep producing, their children would keep eating. That assumption freed them from needing to dominate every moment. It allowed them to be generous without calculation. I wondered what it did to a person to grow up in a country like that. To hear, as a child, there will be more tomorrow, and believe it. To learn that rules existed not just to punish, but to protect. To see power used not to humiliate, but to stabilize. The thought unsettled me deeply, because if strength could look like this, quiet, abundant, unafraid, then everything we had sacrificed for our version of strength felt suddenly, unbearably fragile. I turned onto my side and closed my eyes, but sleep still would not come. Instead, memories rose uninvited. Speeches, marches, promises of destiny and discipline. The constant insistence that the world was hostile and must be met with hardness at every turn. And now, here I was, lying safely in a camp run by my supposed enemy, fed better than civilians back home, protected by rules written by men who believed restraint was not weakness, but duty. I felt something I had not expected. Not shame, not anger, gratitude, a dangerous kind. Not the gratitude that bends you into submission, but the kind that makes you question what you owe your loyalty to. I understood then why this moment mattered beyond our small circle of women standing in a Texas yard. Because this was not just about apples. It was about identity. America was not showing us mercy because it doubted itself. It was showing us mercy because it did not. That realization settled over me slowly, heavily, like a verdict that could not be appealed. They did not defeat us with guns. They defeated us with apples. And in doing so, they forced us to confront a truth far more devastating than any battlefield loss. That a nation could be powerful without being cruel, and that we had been taught to believe otherwise. As the night stretched on, I knew that whatever happened next in the war, whatever borders shifted or flags fell, something inside me had already surrendered. Not to America, but to the idea that strength, when secure, does not need to destroy in order to win. That idea, once planted, would be far harder to uproot than any army. In the days that followed, I began to notice things I had not allowed myself to see before. Not just the food, not just the rules, but the rhythm. America moved with a kind of shared purpose that did not announce itself. The guards rotated shifts without complaint. Trucks arrived on time. Repairs were made quickly and without argument. Even boredom seemed organized, as if everyone understood that this moment, this war, required patience as much as effort. What struck me most was not the size of it all, but the agreement. People seemed to agree on what mattered. They did not all look the same. They did not speak the same way. Some were young farm boys, others factory workers, others men who looked as if they had already lived a lifetime before the war called them. But they behaved as if they were pulling in the same direction. America then felt aligned. There was an enemy. Everyone knew who it was. There was a task. Everyone understood it. And there was an unspoken rule beneath everything else. Whatever differences existed, they would wait. The country I saw through the fence lines of Camp Hearn was not simple, but it was clear. Factories did not argue with farms. Cities did not sneer at fields. People did not question whether sacrifice was necessary. They argued about how to do things better, not whether they should be done at all. That clarity shaped everything. You could feel it in the way Americans worked, not frantically, not desperately, but steadily, as if the outcome was already assumed, and all that remained was to do the job well. I remember thinking that this confidence must be what abundance feels like. Not just material abundance, but moral abundance. The belief that there was enough to go around, enough food, enough time, enough future, even for enemies. That belief made generosity possible without resentment. Years later, when I would hear Americans speak about that time, they often called it simpler. I do not think that word is quite right. It was not simple. It was disciplined, focused, shared. There was a common story people told themselves about who they were and why they were doing what they were doing. Standing in that Texas yard, I felt like I was witnessing a country that believed in itself. Not loudly, not arrogantly, but collectively. And I wonder now, often, what happened to that feeling. Because even then I sensed that it was fragile. I sensed it in small ways. In Reflect Now, I wonder if the question facing America is not whether it can return to some imagined golden age, but whether it can remember what made that moment possible in the first place. Not nostalgia, not myth, but commitment. Commitment to institutions, to restraint, to the idea that power is strongest when it does not need to announce itself. The apple in my hand that day was not just food, it was evidence. Evidence that a country, under the greatest strain in its history, had chosen coherence over cruelty. And so the question that lingers, quietly, insistently, is not one I can answer. It belongs to those who inherited that country. What kind of country do we want to be again? The war ended without ceremony. There was no moment that felt like an ending, no clean line between what had been and what came after. One day we were prisoners waiting behind wire, and the next we were passengers again, moving east across an ocean toward a country that barely resembled the one we had left. Germany greeted us with silence and rubble. Cities lay broken open, as if their insides had been exposed and abandoned. Walls stood without roofs. Streets carried no familiar rhythm, only the sound of footsteps and hunger. The air smelled of ash and damp stone. People moved carefully, eyes lowered, shoulders tight with suspicion. We returned thinner than when we had been captured, but better fed than those who had stayed. That fact followed us everywhere. At ration lines, people stared at our faces, rounder than expected, healthier than was fair. Some looked away, others did not bother to hide their resentment. "You ate well in America," someone muttered once, not quite accusing, not quite asking. I did not know how to answer. How could I explain apples to people who had forgotten what fruit tasted like? How could I explain that Captivity had been the first place in years where tomorrow felt possible? At night, in bombed-out rooms where windows were patched with cloth and paper, I lay awake listening to the sounds of a defeated country trying to breathe again. Hunger returned quickly. Cold followed. But something inside me did not collapse the way it once had, because I carried something back with me. Not food. Memory. I remembered the gravel yard in Texas, the heat, the dust, the weight of an apple in my hand. I remembered how no one had demanded gratitude, how no one had explained themselves, how mercy had been offered without ceremony and without fear. That memory became a kind of quiet resistance. When bitterness threatened to take hold, I remembered restraint. When anger rose easily, I remembered abundance used carefully. When despair whispered that cruelty was the natural order of things, I remembered that I had seen proof otherwise. Years passed. Life rebuilt itself unevenly, stubbornly. Families formed. Children were born. They grew up in a country that rarely spoke about defeat without defensiveness and rarely spoke about captivity at all. Some stories were easier to forget, but the apple story stayed. It became something we told carefully, almost reverently, not to excuse anything, not to shift blame, but to acknowledge a truth that felt too important to lose working long hours in factories. Unity did not erase fear or grief, it organized them. But unity required something rare. Trust. Trust that the person next to you was sacrificing too. Trust that the rules applied to everyone. Trust that tomorrow was not just promised, but being built. It is impossible for me to speak about America now without acknowledging that I am an outsider looking back. My view is shaped by memory, by distance, by the shock of contrast. But perhaps that distance gives clarity. When I listen to Americans today, I hear doubt where there was once assumption. I hear suspicion where there was once cooperation. I hear arguments not about how to win together, but about whether there is still a together at all. The factories that once roared day and night are quieter. The farms still produce, but fewer people feel connected to them. Work feels divided into categories that compete rather than complement. People speak of each other with caution instead of confidence. Most striking of all, I hear uncertainty about the future. Not fear of an enemy across the ocean, but fear of one another. That is a different kind of war. In 1944, America's strength came from believing it could absorb hardship without tearing itself apart. That belief allowed it to treat prisoners humanely, to plan beyond immediate victory, to think in decades instead of days. Today, I hear Americans asking whether kindness is still affordable, whether generosity is still safe, whether rules still bind everyone equally. Those questions would have been unthinkable in the camp where I stood holding an apple. Not because the people were better, but because the story they shared was stronger. I think often about that phrase the cowboy used so casually. There will be more tomorrow. It was not optimism. It was infrastructure. It was factories and fields and railroads and trust stitched together into something durable. It was the belief that if you did your part today, the system would hold. When that belief weakens, everything else begins to feel risky. Generosity becomes suspect. Mercy feels naive. Restraint looks like weakness. And yet, I know, because I lived it, that America was once strong enough to reject that fear. Strong enough to believe that treating enemies like humans did not diminish victory. It secured it. I do not say this to scold. I say it because memory carries responsibility. The America I encountered in 1944 did not agree on everything, but it agreed on enough. Enough to produce at unimaginable scale, enough to send millions overseas, enough to feed prisoners apples without expecting applause. That agreement did not come from perfection. It came from shared purpose, shared ethics, shared belief in tomorrow. As I reflect now, I want important to lose. That truth surfaced again decades later, in voices that were not my own. My grandchildren learned about the war the way all children do, through fragments, through textbooks, through questions asked too late in the evening. One day, one of them asked me what America had been like. I told them the truth. I told them that the people who held me prisoner had treated me like a human being. I told them that when they did not have to, they fed us. Years later, I saw those words appear elsewhere. In letters, in interviews, in quiet statements left beneath articles and documentaries. Children and grandchildren of prisoners speaking across time and borders. Because they were treated like humans. We exist. They fed them when they didn't have to. Each time I read those words, something in my chest tightened, because gratitude, when it arrives generations later, carries a different weight. It is not emotional. It is factual. It says this decision mattered. It says what you choose to do with power echoes longer than victory parades ever will. The United States did not know us. They did not owe us mercy. They did not gain immediate advantage from feeding us fruit or honoring rules written on distant paper. And yet, they did. Not perfectly, not universally, but deliberately. They chose to believe that how a war is fought shapes what comes after it. I often think about that choice now, standing at the far end of history, looking back. Germany lost the war on the battlefield. That much is undeniable. But many of us were defeated forever by something far stronger. Not bombs, not tanks, not armies. American mercy. It defeated the lie that cruelty is strength. It defeated the belief that fear is the only way to rule. It defeated us by forcing us to confront a version of power that did not need to destroy in order to prevail. That is the legacy I carry. Not shame, not absolution, but gratitude. And the quiet hope that somewhere, someone hearing this story understands what was truly at stake in that gravel yard in Texas. Not the fate of prisoners, but the soul of a nation strong enough to choose restraint when it did not have to. That is why these stories matter. Because long after war's end, it is not victory that survives the longest. It is how the winners behaved when no one was forcing them to be kind.